Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar titled Testing Embryos, How Far Should We Go? This webinar is organized by the Hastings Center for Bioethics, and it's the first in a series that we titled Frontiers in the Ethics of Human Reproduction. This series will continue into 2026, and we invite everybody to register for our newsletter so that you can join the next ones. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. The chat is disabled, and we will collect them right after the presentations from our wonderful panelists, and we'll try to address as many of them as possible. So our topic tonight is not just how we make babies, but what kind of babies we make. And I'll kick off by telling you that many years ago, when I started working in the area of reproductive ethics, I excitedly told my grandfather about all the possible things, the new things that we can do, IVF, and get human embryos outside of the body, and we can put them in a dish, and we can test them and know all sorts of things about them. And he smiled and said to me in Yiddish with a wink, you know, Vardit, the old-fashioned way was better. So maybe it was, but what we will share with you tonight is really the new way. We're going to talk about a technology that has been around since the 90s, but is pushing the boundaries right now. Let's start from the basics. When we do IVF, we get the egg out of the woman's body, we fertilize it with sperm, and we get a human embryo in a dish. We have never been able to do that in the history of our species. Those human embryos were always inside the human body, and so we didn't have access to them the way we do today. Now imagine that you went through IVF and produced, let's say, 6 embryos. Now they're all sitting there in front of you in their individual dishes, and you can test their genetics, and you can pick which one to implant, the one that you want based on the information that you now received. In most countries, this technology, Nat, let's wait. Oh, in most countries, this technology is heavily regulated. You can't test for anything that you want, and you can't pick any embryo that you want. But here in the United States, we do not regulate it. So back in the 90s, when we started using this technology, and we call it pre-implantation genetic testing, because we don't have a pregnancy yet. We're just determining which one will proceed to a pregnancy, which one will be implanted. Back in the 90s, we tested one gene for one disease. And we usually did it because there was a disease in the family, a genetic disease, and we wanted to prevent its transmission to future generations. Fast forward to 2025, we can use similar technologies to sequence practically the entire genome of that embryo. We can test for multiple genes that are associated with many diseases, conditions, disabilities, and even human traits like eye color. And we're starting to offer prospective parents this technology for screening for disease. We're not looking for something that runs in the family. We're screening for common disease like diabetes and cardio and cancer. And we're screening for increased risk of these diseases, not for a certainty that they will appear. So the ethical landscape has become very complex, and we're here to discuss it with our amazing panelists. First, with Nat De Luca, who is an ICU chaplain and a student in the Masters of Bioethics program at Harvard. And he is a father of 2 darling children that he calls his designer babies. We'll hear from him why he calls them that in a minute. Then we're going to zoom up from this patient or user experience to Dr. Avner Hirschlag, who is a fertility doctor with decades of clinical expertise in the field. And then we're going to zoom out even further to another doctor, Dr. Louise King, who is a national leader in reproductive bioethics and the director of reproductive bioethics at Harvard Medical School. And I'm very fortunate that she's agreed to teach this topic with me every year, where we have a lot of fun playing around with these issues. And she often tells our students that it puts her brain into a pretzel mode. And I think that tonight's discussion will put your brains into a pretzel mode as well, because the aspects are very complicated. So let's start gradually. We explained what the technology is at a very high level. Let's hear from Nat how he chose to use it. Take it away, Nat.
Thank you, Vardit. And if we can have my first slide of my beautiful designer babies for everyone to see what this technology can get you. We have our daughter Zoe on the left, who is already working off the bill for the immense cost of her conception. And we have Sebastian on the right, our son. And my husband and I chose to have our kids. Well, we didn't choose. We couldn't do the old-fashioned way. We had to do the new-fashioned way. We had to have two different surrogates. We had to have an egg donor, an IVF lab, many lawyers. These children were conceived in a great community of people and brought into this world through many, many steps and choices that we had to make along the way. The first choice, if you can go to my next slide here, the first choice was of an egg donor because my husband and I are not capable of producing our own eggs. My husband is Jewish. I'm a convert, and it was very important to us to have a Jewish egg. And this is our first choice, our first trait that we chose. A Jewish egg is not just a selection of particular genes, but for us, it is more of it's a metaphysical trait. It's an inheritance. It's a legacy. It is not just genes, but is a selection of a genealogy. It is entering you into a story. And that was really important for us as a family, that our child had genes that connected them to an ancient story. This might sound strange for people who aren't, Jewish, but for us, this was so important that these genes connected them to this lineage. The second choice that we had to choose was who was going to be the genetic father of each child. This was, in the middle column, it says genetic father, handsome versus pretty. We chose that I would probably be the better genetic father of a boy, and my husband would be the better genetic father of a girl. We looked at our general physiologies, and that's how we chose. But this was another choice point that we had to make of who was going to be the genetic father of each child. And then we also, just very briefly about the surrogates, they choose you, we didn't choose them. And this was another choice point that we had along the way of what the developmental environment of our fetus is going to be. And we had control over agreed upon control of what the surrogate could eat, what their medical care was going to be like, if they could travel more than 100 miles away from their home. So this was another set of choices that we had to make along the way in conceiving of our children. And if you go to the next slide, please. Just backing up a moment, just about the egg donor selection. Again, we didn't flip through like endless examples of women that we could get an egg from. We went to an agency and they said, this is the woman that we think is right for you at this time. We only had one choice. It was her or no one at that point. But then we got an extensive dossier, and we were given, 40, 50 pages of information on her. And this is just a tiny little piece of information that we got. And when we're talking about trait selection, it's interesting that they give you such this granular detail about the egg donor's grandparents and parents. And even with this information, you can kind of do your own Mendelian, you can do sort of a Punnett square of what are the chances that our children are going to have a particular eye color. That's one of the traits that comes up a lot is, selecting for eye color. And, we did the calculations, and my daughter has very beautiful dark brown eyes, and my son has navy blue eyes. And it is really interesting when he was first born, they were blue. And people would say, oh, I hope that you'll be really lucky if they stay blue. And no one ever comments about the color of our daughter's eyes. So it is really interesting to see how people already sort of have a hierarchy of the preference of traits that we've experienced firsthand. And even I was doing it when I first saw this, when even before we started creating embryos, I was already doing my calculations of what's the likelihood of our children having blue eyes. And I was like, oh, it's 8.25% for for one or the other. Um, so this is just another example of the information that you were given in this process. And then if you can go to the next slide, please. So another thing that happens along the way when you are creating embryos is you might have mosaic embryos, and I'm sure the other panelists will talk about this more. I'm just going to check my time. Oh, I've got plenty of time to talk. Um, Mosaic embryos. This is their policy of the IVF clinic is that, and I'm not going to read this all for you, but they do not transfer mosaic embryos. They will only transfer embryos that have the highest chance of creating a healthy pregnancy that are suitable to transfer. And for that is the embryos that have the correct number of chromosomes. So this rules out any sort of trisomies or anything else. And if you go, Vardit.
Nat, I'm just going to jump in for those who are not from the field to say that that
Mhm.
means an embryo where some cells have maybe the wrong number of chromosomes and some have the correct number. And many clinics do not transfer those like yours. And Avnel will tell us, Dr. Hirschlag will tell us more about that, but I just wanted to explain the word that you used.
Thank you, Vardit. And I think it's really important. If you look at the date of this, when this was 2021. And I think some interesting studies have come out since then about the viability of mosaic embryos. Um, I think somewhere along here in the very scary language that they have in some of the paragraphs on the bottom, they say that this is based on the best information that they have at the time. And I think that that information has changed substantially in the past 4 years or so. So this is just another choice point, the fourth choice point that we had to go through. It wasn't actually a choice of ours because I think we had 15 embryos between the two of us that we could use. So we had plenty of, quote unquote, healthy embryos that we could use instead. And then if you go to the next slide, please. So this is how you choose what baby you want to have. Once your embryos are made and they're graded and they go through all of the PGT testing, you get these gradings on the side, the 5AB or 6AA, and one of our physicians can explain that much better than I can. But then there is the plain language on the right side. We say the first one is abnormal. They're not going to use that one. The embryo 3 is a mosaic embryo. They wouldn't use that one either. So the first embryo or the second one that we transplanted, my first genetic child was embryo 4XY. His name was Bodhi. Very tragically, we lost him to a miscarriage in the second trimester. But then I had another son who I believe, was one of the other embryos, the 6AA, the untested ones that we went and tested later on. For Johnny's embryos, he only had one girl. So I only had one boy and he only had one girl. So it was very clear which ones we were going to choose. And he chose the embryo 4XX, and that is our daughter Zoe. So that was when we went through all the other choices and decisions and ways of thinking about it and what egg donor we were going to use, what surrogates we were going to use, who was going to be the father. We were finally presented with this list of saying, which one of these embryos do you want to join your family? And it's a hard decision because we still have embryos that are not that are on ice still, and I wish they could be part of our family, but we have now run out of money. So these are the choices that we had to go through, and I really wanted to And it's this and a million other choices as well along the way. And I think it's important to put this PGT testing and other genetic testing sort of in the ecosystem of a family navigating this very, at times, confusing, stressful, and joyful and tragic course of events that can happen when you are creating a baby, not the old-fashioned way, but in a way that involves so many other people and in a way that everyone's privacy is gone. It's all out in the open, and it is a beautiful process. And looking back, I would not change anything. I wouldn't have made any different choices at this point. Going forward in the future, I think knowing what I know now, that might be different.
So Nat, you have 3 or 4 minutes left, and we want to ask you, first of all, can you say, you mentioned running out of money. I didn't
Mhm.
dare bring it up myself, but you
Sure, no,
did.
I would be completely transparent
So
about it.
if you could say a word about that. And also, did you sequence the entire genome in order to select the sex? Well, the sex you didn't have to do whole genome, but did you look at traits at all? So if you can briefly speak to these 2 points, and we'll listen to Dr. Hirschlag about the
Sure.
clinical aspect.
Do you want the full price tag? Do you want me to say what the full price tag is?
I'm not pushing you to share
I
anything
will
you don't
say it.
want
No,
to share.
absolutely. I think it's a very important thing. We recently had to go through the very arduous task of making our children British citizens because my husband is British, and we had to go through all of our receipts, and it was about $250,000 for 2 children. And that is with 3 cycles. That is with two, we had 3 surrogate cycles. So that adds a significant amount of money. Each of those is a lot of money. And I joke that we could have had 2 G-Wagons, Mercedes G-Wagons, instead of 2 children, but the Mercedes won't take care of us when we're old. And what was your second question?
Did you look at genes that
Oh, yes.
underlie certain traits, not physical conditions?
We did not do that. That was not available to us. I think that was done um, sort of after the fact. I know we got that screening back from the state of Minnesota. They do a full genome sequencing. So I know we got a list of like 400 traits after our son was born. But the only thing that we did for us was we did our analysis of the paternal DNA because my husband is at risk of Tay-Sachs and I'm at risk of I'm going to say this wrong, thalassemia, because he's Jewish, I'm Italian. And so we had to rule those two out. But we did not, that was never offered to us.
Did you look at common diseases like the chance of heart disease, the chance of cancer?
That was never offered to us, and I would not have been interested in that because I think that those are what we would call adult onset diseases, and I think that it's impossible to prognosticate about that. At this point in the technology, a generation from now, 100 years from now, I think the technology might be very different. But in the world that we live in, I don't think that that would not have been useful information for me.
Thank you. So in the 1 minute that we have left, I'm going to throw you a curveball because we have
Please.
discussed it in the past, both of us.
Hmm.
Considering the price tag, and even if you remove the surrogacy, we're still talking about tens of thousands of dollars.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts as a bioethicist about the equity and the access to this technology? In
Yeah,
one sentence, just like intuitive answer.
I think I think immense inequality exists in society, and this is a very, very small percentage of that inequality. And we wouldn't be able to have children without it. And so if we want to have reproductive equality, I think we have to allow it. But if we start talking about whether or not this should be allowed, I think that there are other things in line in front of it that we should consider first.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Nat.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate you sharing this because I think for a lot of people listening to us this evening, this is possibly the first time that they heard a firsthand experience of the whole process. So thank you for that. Dr. Hirschlag, let's zoom out to the clinic level and hear from you what technologies are established, what are emerging, what do you see on the horizon, and how do you feel about all of this?
Let me just share. Okay. Hi, everybody. Nat, I want to congratulate you for the 2 babies, and it's amazing what can be done for a couple like yourselves and make you so happy. I think what I'll talk about kind of follows your specific story to some degree. And let's start with mosaic embryos. So first of all, I'll just say in general about pre-implantation genetic testing that was started in 1990 by Alan Handyside, was the first one. And IVF went from just helping people have babies to doing the utmost we can to have healthy babies. And therefore, genetics plays a major role. And we were very lucky to be at the intersection between genetics and reproductive technology. So let's start right with a few ethical alerts. So along with the benefit, the huge benefit of preventing genetic disease, multiple ethical issues have been brought up to the forefront. So the first one is mosaic embryos. And what mosaic embryos are, they're basically one embryo does not have all the same cells. And some of the cells have different genetics. And it took us quite a while to figure it out. And I don't think we still have figured out altogether. And I asked in one of the conferences whether any of us are mosaics. Do we know that all of our cells are the same? And does it matter? So what happened is, in Nat's case, they didn't allow him to transfer a mosaic embryo. But today, the current approach is more and more increasing transferring these embryos, especially when it's the only embryo left. And we talked about access and equality, and that's one of the issues. That IVF is very expensive in the United States. We don't have national insurance that covers it. A lot of our patients are not covered, and there's a big problem if a mosaic embryo is the only one that you have. And the other thing is that now several centers have published a very good pregnancy rate. One of them is 30% live birth rate, and the other one just recently published a 50% pregnancy rate, so no difference in their mind between mosaic and non-mosaic. But I have here a list.
That's a pregnancy rate. Are these healthy children that are born?
Yes. So there is no evidence that there is any problem. Most of the times, the reproductive endocrinologist will suggest to the patient and their OB to do a prenatal diagnosis by CVS or amniocentesis, and they have not been any different. So not to be nonchalant about it, just to say that we're moving forward with mosaics. So we, in many cases, will transfer them. The next one is even harder, and that is transferring embryos that actually have the disease that you tested for. So I just brought in very quick 2 cases because Vardit has been on my case to shorten this presentation. So one patient, they happened to be a scientist, both husband and wife, carried the FAP, familial adenomatous polyposis, polyps that create cancer. Look on top what it says. If you don't do anything about it, 100% will develop colorectal cancer. The patient already had cancer in his mother, colon cancer. And they wanted that embryo because that was the embryo they had that was normal by chromosomes, and they had maybe financial reasons or others. And that was a difficult dilemma. And you see here what happens in time. So most of these patients, what you could argue is, well, they can have colonoscopies and they can have prophylactic total colectomy. That's a very big deal to decide for a newborn baby. The next one is a BRCA patient. This patient came to us. She was already 40 years old and already had breast cancer, not the typical fertility preservation that I do, where I actually get eggs and embryos, make eggs and embryos before chemo. So she was able to make embryos, and the first one was a healthy boy, did not have the BRCA gene, and actually she delivered that boy. Then she comes back. She has a BRCA carrying female, normal from chromosomes, but carrying the BRCA, and she insisted on transferring it. You see here on the graphic what is the chance lifetime of developing breast cancer. You see, we get different numbers, but it goes up to 80, 90% lifetime chance. And also the chance of ovarian cancer is 30, 40% in most reports. So transferring affected embryos. What is the pro? What is the cons? The patient has a reproductive liberty. In America, that's how we feel. They don't feel like this in Europe necessarily, but it's their embryos, the couple's embryos. They have autonomy. However, and they can claim that the baby wouldn't have been born had we not done a transfer. So it's the benefit of existence. However, on the other side is our autonomy. I had the autonomy of doing no harm and not transferring an embryo that will cause cancer. And it's the general act of doing good and worrying about the well-being of offspring. There's also the liability issue. Honestly, that's not the first thing I worry about, but our lawyers definitely do. And we have Louise here, she'll tell us about that. Now, what about whole genome? So Vardit asked Nat if he had a whole genome. So very interesting, because right now, patients are not screened for all of their genes. They're screened by a panel, and that platform is decided upon by, if you want, the genetic testing company. Right now, I'm testing with a platform that's about over 500 genes. So what happens if we didn't test for it? But there is another question, and that is something called de novo mutations. The embryo can have a mutation that we didn't predict. It didn't come not from the mother, not from the father. So here is one case I wanted to show you very quickly, and that is quickly, Vardit, I know, because it was a physician of mine, a dear patient of mine, that got a donation from her own sister, who was 26 years old, and the baby bled when he had a circumcision, and that's how it was diagnosed, that she gave her sister hemophilia. She gave her sister hemophilia. How can that happen? And I was like, going back to my history, did I miss anything? Did I miss any case in the family? And by the way, you can miss it. It's X-linked. And if it's only carried by females, may not show up until it's a male baby. However, the mother was hemophilia free, and this was a de novo mutation. Now, in those panels, the new panels that now suggest to do whole genome testing, new mutations that were not inherited from the parents will be discovered. Can we prevent autism? So I'm just throwing that at you, including the fact that autism has increased by over 300%. And a lot of people say, well, you know, your diagnostic criteria is changing, and that's why. But we think there is a real increase. And the question is, what portion is genetic? And how complicated will it be to test for it? Well, we think a lot of those genes they're called neurodegenerative genes, sit on the X chromosomes. Okay, so mother carries them, males get them, male to female ratio may point to that fact, even though we know there's autism also in females. So, so that's one of the challenges, that if we break the code, if we break the genetic code for autism, this might take us a very long ways. So now we get to traits, which was mentioned before by Vardit, and making designer babies. Where are we with that? And I reviewed for you what is it? Five programs now, 5 different startups, if you want, Silicon Valley, etc., that are doing trait selection, and they offer. And the price tag, at least on one of them, you can see here, is $50,000. They offer screening for IQ, for height, for eye and hair color, for longevity, and the question is, can they do it reliably? How far is the science going? And what is the proof? I saw one of their videos, and they gave an IQ prediction. They do grading of ranking of the embryo. So the best embryo, they said, could be an average of IQ of 120. However, there was a standard deviation, and the standard deviation was about 20%, which means it's plus or minus 20. So that baby that you paid $50,000 to have it transferred because it's going to be a smarty pants and go to an Ivy League school is going to make it, is going to not make it if it's the plus or minus 20, and it has an IQ, just an average IQ, and you spent all this money. And not only that, you're going to be disappointed every day. And what is the baby going to feel who is now growing to be an adult, and he knows that his parents invested a fortune in his smartness? The other issue is obviously what else affects us. For example, longevity. So what, you're going to give a longevity gene and then the person is going to eat fast food and become morbidly obese and cut his or her life expectancy by I don't know how much, and develop diabetes and hypertension and heart disease and all of the above. I'm not putting it down. I think it's a very interesting thing, but it is eugenics. And it definitely draws the line between the privileged and the less privileged financially. And I want to show you, to finish this slide, I made it the one on the right is my artwork with a little bit of help to show you the slippery slope that's actually happening. On the left, you see the slippery slope from Sandel's work. So Michael Sandel was kind of my ethical Bible, okay? Wrote a very skinny book, a professor from Harvard, a very skinny book, and it's about the case for
against perfection.
The case for imperfection, and he predicted this and reminded us of the history of eugenics. And just to let you know, I live in Cold Spring Harbor. This is where American eugenics started in the 1900s with a registry of the good families and the bad families. And guess who read that? The American eugenics. Hitler was aware of it when he developed his book, when he wrote his book Mein Kampf, and then went on to do a selection of traits. So a big warning. I'll finish here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Avner. This was very educational and fascinating, and you flooded all of the ethical issues. Could you stop your screen? Thank you so much. I'm just reminding the viewers that you can already put questions in the Q&A. We have a few interesting ones that I'm collecting. We're going to zoom further out. And Louise, I can't wait to hear your thoughts about everything you heard so far. And, you know, Nat brought us down to the very personal family experience. Avner brought us to the level of the clinic, what he's comfortable with doing, what is offered. How do you sort of compare and contrast that very individual level to the societal level? And what are your views on what you're seeing overall in the bioethics literature on this?
Great question, or series of questions. Nat, thank you so much for being willing to participate in this. Sharing your story is incredibly helpful to put a face to this. Your face and your children's faces, your husband's face not yet included, at least in the pictures you shared. I think starting with your story is very important because the discussions that we have with individual patients, and for full disclosure, I'm not a reproductive endocrinologist. I do surgery mostly, but I end up speaking with a lot of patients who are facing infertility who need surgical interventions, and I participate in some of the discussions around these topics. But the moment where you're sitting across the table from someone who is making these types of decisions, and it's a very personal decision, we always tend, and probably rightly so, to err on the side of supporting as much as possible the patient's autonomy across the table from us to make decisions that they feel are correct. And one of my mentors in ethics analogized this to me as the same way that we prioritize the rights and duties of parents who are making decisions for the children that already exist in the world. We, as parents, take on those duties to try to decide how best to support our children in having the best lives possible. Almost every parent is focused on that. And that might involve decisions we make about school, ways that we put pressure on our children to do different things. And so to a certain extent, some of the decisions that are being discussed in this wide-ranging discussion are very analogous to the types of decisions we make for our children when they do already exist in the world, even though we're making them ahead of them existing. So for example, choosing a Jewish donor, right? I think that is the type of decision that's deeply analogous to the same types of decisions I make as also a Jew by choice for my child when she did her bat mitzvah, et cetera, right? Those are fairly analogous. So I wouldn't argue that some of the decisions that are open to us as prospective parents and as clinicians helping prospective parents are simply by virtue of being choices we could make that we could not make in natural fertility, that just by nature of them existing, they are wrong or that we should avoid them. I also actually wouldn't describe your children as designer babies even, but not that they're not absolutely gorgeous and designer in that sense, but that when I think of designer babies, I'm thinking of some of the things that are coming down the pike that Avner, you so beautifully alluded to. When we start really getting into whole genome sequencing, and these companies are trying to advertise for screening for disease that is multifactorial, multigenetic, or screening for traits that are multifactorial, multigenetic, as you alluded to with autism. You're going to be looking at probabilities and selecting and creating a large number of embryos to be able to try to avoid some of those probabilities. And even then, regardless, there's the possibility of de novo mutations, but also you're just dealing in probabilities. So for example, some of the screenings for diabetes to avoid diabetes or hypertension, or some of the things that have been proposed by these companies, they're going to be able to predict that a particular embryo has 60% chance of diabetes. What does that even mean? And how is that impacted by a future child's environment and even the choices that future human being as an adult will make for themselves? So there is obviously a gradation in trait selection or in screening that we can do. And I'm a huge fan myself of The Case Against Perfection and Michael Sandel's work. There's also a wonderful book titled Choosing Children, which I'll remember the author's name in a moment. But both of them advocate that clearly we need to be careful as we venture further and further down this road and start dipping our toes, again, as Avner alluded to, into true eugenics. Because when you start really getting into the nitty-gritty of selection in these scenarios, you will be, I mean, that is the definition of a eugenics. We can't really go against that. I think two other things come into play in the discussion that we're going to have in a moment. One would be, what would we lose, right? Sandel's work emphasizes that when we step back from making too many decisions and try not to control too many things, the incredible beauty and randomness of how our reproduction happens just by combining an egg and sperm and how the genes come out creates the incredible diversity that we see in our world and has the magic of creating some incredible people out there that we couldn't have potentially thought of. So if we're too rigid in what we start to select for example, if we start to avoid autism, autism has a spectrum to it. Granted, it's unpredictable, but there are some incredible individuals that out in the world with autism who achieve absolutely outstanding, wonderful things. And if we get rid of that, what do we lose? I've spent most of my life working with the Special Olympics from the time I was a very young child because of my father's involvement with the organization. So I've been lucky enough to spend a ton of time around persons who have trisomy 21. They bring immense joy to the world. There are many countries in the world who have, through a variety of approaches, almost eliminated that condition in their population. What have we lost? A vast majority of the artists in our world have mental health disorders that these companies are seeking to help us try to eliminate. Are we then also eliminating some level of creativity? What would we lose is my question to us if we try to control too much. Also, what pressures are we putting on families by affording them so many choices? In the realm of end-of-life decision making, there's a whole body of literature about the burden of choice, and that it's incredibly important for us to afford people all the choices that we can think of and couch them in really careful language and counseling. But each choice that we give people creates burden, decisional burden, emotional burden, and financial burden, as you've described. At some point, again, I'm not sure exactly where the spot is. There's got to be a place where all of these things even themselves out, and we can, as a society, come to a conclusion that that might be too much burden to put on. That might lead us too much into the realm of eugenics. Or maybe we'll be losing too much by controlling too much. So in the US, we have really no method to regulate this. In much other areas of medicine, before I can offer someone a particular surgical intervention or a new surgical technique or surgical tool, it goes through a whole level of discussion and testing and yada, yada, yada. And then people say to me, yes, you can use that medicine, or no, you cannot use that medicine. We have oversight that controls this. There is a lot of regulation in the US around the safety of assisted reproduction, around reporting. I'm not saying there's no legislation or regulation there at all, but there is none around the rollout of this whole genome sequencing option that is now being marketed to people quite aggressively. That is, in my opinion, a problem. I think that by taking ourselves out of this, very personal discussion with each of our patients and into our role as professionals, as people who evaluate things and come together in large groups to decide what would be appropriate and best to be offering to patients. We really should have a national conversation with experts in the field, with people from the public, with a wide variety of different people involved to create some guardrails around using this technology and around where it would be offered. Where I would set the limits probably wouldn't have changed anything that you chose to do, Nat, at all. I would have left all of that open. And I would just want to ensure that you had every opportunity to sort of go off of the path and not feel that you had to do those things, but that you could if you wish to. And also that you had, and I think you did, tremendous support to know how to speak to your children about the decisions that you've made or not to do so, which is, by the way, one of the questions you're going to get in a minute. I saw it in the chat. But on the other side of things, with like this whole genome sequencing aspect of stuff, I really think we need to pull back for a minute and think carefully as a society about whether this should truly be on the table or not, because we could get into some serious problems. The last thing I would mention is that the disparity issue, in my mind, doesn't really. I would never want to say that a couple like yourself and your husband shouldn't be able to access IVF, 100%, 100%. But I would say that before we go into this realm of trait selection, if we decide as a society that we actually could do that ethically, which again, I highly question, before we even go there, before that's even on the table, we should make sure that all people, including couples like yourselves, could access IVF easily and with less expense, right? I would prefer to spend my money and time in making sure that that's the case, and investing in better technology to make IVF less expensive, et cetera, right? Let's focus our attention there before we go into an area of and invest a huge amount of money in a heavily marketed space that is ethically questionable.
Thank you, Louise. The questions have piled up into a mountain of ethical complexities, and I'm going to group them. Avnel, some are for you specifically because they wish more clarity on the discussions you have with patients or on the genetics, but Louise and Nat jump right in with your perspectives. So the first cluster of questions, people are on the screen are really curious about what happens when the only available embryos are not healthy. So somebody asks, hypothetically, let's assume all the embryos that were created are affected by some medical condition except one, and that one has trisomy 21, Down syndrome. The couple wishes to have that embryo transferred since it's their only choice. What is the conversation? What is the discussion that you would have with this couple? And another listener is saying, you talk about patients who use IVF and the only viable embryos have disease genes. Trisomy 21 is not a disease. It's a healthy child with a difference. But what if all the embryos have some genes underlying diseases, even leading to serious disease, and the doctor doesn't want to transfer, the couple does, but you know that if they didn't use IVF, they would have that child spontaneously or naturally. Does that affect your thought process and your conversation with other patients about agreeing or refusing to transfer an embryo with a disease-causing gene? So it's sort of the spectrum from trisomy 21, which is not a disease, all the way to diseases and even serious diseases. How do you have these conversations? And the last question in that cluster is, people want to hear more about that couple that wanted to implant the embryo with a FAP that had a 100% chance of developing cancer. What was their reasoning? How did you frame that ethical dilemma when you spoke to them? So people want to hear more about those conversations that you're having with families.
Yeah, so thank you, and I'm happy that the listeners, the audiences are really getting in the thick of things. These are all difficult cases. Starting with an unaffected, an embryo that has 3 copies of chromosome number 21, and therefore it's going to be Down syndrome, but is normal for a gene. I think that conversation is the easiest of the other cases, and that is that we discuss what the patients know about Down syndrome and what do they expect raising a child, and have they thought about the child living as a Down syndrome baby for an adult. And I think that personally, I would have no problem transferring it after they've had this discussion. We generally like them to always meet with a genetic counselor as well. but I don't want to brush off my responsibility. So that's case number one. Now, the other case is the was what? That there is
genes that
all the
underlie
embryos.
a serious genetic disease.
Yeah, okay. So they're saying, well, what's the difference? Had we not come to you and just had sex, we would have had an affected baby. Well, that is exactly what PGD is for. So I want to be very, very firm about this. The mission of PGT is to prevent genetic disease. People have the freedom of not stepping into our office, and they have sex. And then what? If he knows that if he or she carry a gene, what are they going to do about it? Are they going to do a prenatal diagnosis? And if the baby is affected, they're going to abort it? Or are they going to have the baby who has, let's say, Huntington's disease, and 100% at 50 will die? Okay? These are very, very important questions. So this I would fight the patient on, and I would say, hey, what is PGD? We are trying to avoid genetic terminations. We're trying to help you as much as possible have a baby that does not have the serious disease that you carry. Now, going to the FAP, which is similar, but not exactly the same. FAP, the gene that causes colon cancer, is milder from the point of view that it's really preventable. If you are going to, if a baby is born with it, you know, as an adult, they can have follow-up followed by colectomy. I've even been scrubbed on some of these cases in my surgical days. It's a very difficult surgery, but you can survive it and live a pretty normal life. But what the motivation of a couple like this, one of the motivations when we talk about genetics, sorry, I'm on call also. One of the motivations of people who don't want the baby to be different than them is because they feel it's diminishing themselves. And there have been requests of deaf couples to have a deaf child. There have been requests of dwarfs with achondroplasia to have a dwarf, to have a little child, okay? And that's really understandable and discussed in the ethical field. I'm going to throw it to the other panelists.
Louise, do you want to say a word about these cases?
Well, I'd just love to ask Avner, what about the patient with a potentially affected embryo with Huntington's, but this is the last embryo they have available to transfer? You can create whatever scenario would create that. They're in their late 40s, whatever you'd like. And they acknowledge that the child would have a short life, shorter than some, but still would have a significantly long life, absent something else going wrong. What of that person who's saying to you, yes, but this is my last embryo, and this is the only one I have available to me?
So Louise, I didn't present it, but Huntington's presents a very special dilemma because you usually have a person comes, that's my cases have been typically father just died from Huntington's. They come very shortly afterwards, still in their bereavement period. They want their children to be Huntington disease free, but they don't want to know if they carry the disease. And we have a special technique in the lab to do that. But that's an ethical issue by itself, okay? I would really try to convince them. This is where I want to say something passionate that my partners in our clinic, which is Island Fertility, the fertility clinic of Stony Brook, are listening. They're watching right now. And they know what I do in such a case. I go to Melissa, who is our clinical director, and I ask her to give a free cycle, okay? Or at least a highly discounted cycle. I will not accept the fact that, oh, it's my last embryo, and I'm going to have a baby who's going to have a horrible disease 100%. I mean, Huntington is just a terrible, terrible disease. By the way, different than a BRCA, for example, where there is a 20% that they won't have breast cancer, and there's a lot of monitoring, and they can do prophylactic mastectomy. There is no prophylactic, there's no cure, okay, for Huntington's. So I would fight them on this. And I would not just fight them, but as a compassionate reproductive geneticist, I would try to get them more embryos because it's a 50% chance to have a normal embryo, and we should find one.
Thank you so much. Nat, I'm pulling you into the conversation in a sort of strange way. You cared a lot about having healthy children.
Mm-hmm.
What is your perception of people who wish to implant an affected embryo?
I think it is, everyone should have the choice to be able to do that. I think people can live very fulfilling, wonderful lives, regardless of the genes that they are born with. Some people have no choice but to implant the one and only embryo that they have left. I know, especially in the disability literature, there's talk about people wanting to keep their subcultures alive. For example, deaf culture. If I could, I would have chosen my children to be gay. Being straight sounds really boring, and I wouldn't want to wish that on anyone. Sorry, everyone. So these subcultures are very important, and they are built around difference. And so many of the things that we think of as disability are, in fact, inequality in society, that can be that we can adjust for. So I think we need to be a little bit more creative in our thinking about how society supports people with disabilities, rather than wanting to just erase them from society. I don't want to lift disability up on a pedestal, and that it is the source of all of our suffering as a creator of something that is not available otherwise, as it's where artistic production comes from. I think that it doesn't necessarily have to come from a place of suffering. Not everyone I know who has a mental illness or lives with depression is a brilliant artist or a musician. I was talking to someone very recently, very close to me, who I've been polling people about genetic engineering of for the lay people, I call it genetic engineering of embryos. And they had a rare childhood cancer, they have bipolar disorder, and they had PCOS. And I said, would you have wanted to have those things selected for out of at born? And they said, absolutely, I would not have wanted to live through all these things. And they are an artist. And they would have rather not to have lived through these would have been lifelong debilitating conditions. So I think that we can think a bit more broadly about how we allow these things in society.
Thank you, Nat.
Can I respond really quickly?
Sure. And then we have a cluster of questions exactly on what Nat just.
Yeah. Nat, I think what you're describing is a possible future where we could take an embryo and edit those things out, but keep that embryo, which again is a very different thing and carries different ethical weight to it, versus the non-identity issue, which we've been sort of playing around, which is if under the current proposed way of doing this, your friend who obviously has had a lot of suffering would not have existed. Somebody else would have existed without PCOS. So the Jonathan Glover is the other author that I wanted to mention, along with Michael Sandel, and they both write about not to glorify disability, but just write about if we start to try to control too much, what do we lose that person that didn't exist? I always use the example of family members that I have who have depression or whatever it might be, who are also artists or aren't artists, but have all their wonderful ideas. What do we lose in each individual person that then doesn't exist? is what I was getting at, just to clarify. Thanks for the
I
time.
absolutely agree. I don't want a bunch of perfect people walking around. I think it would be extremely boring. I don't know any perfect people, actually. I know very imperfect people, and they are what makes life joyful and glorious and help us get through the slog of life. The people who stare into the darkness the most are the ones who help us see the light the brightest. So I think that it's so important that we keep the whole human family together.
Thank you, Nat. That was inspiring.
I'm a chaplain,
So
so I have a lot of good lines like that if anyone else needs some inspiration.
you're the pro. You're the pro. So a few listeners are kind of addressing the elephant in the room, which is right in the title of our webinar today. And somebody's asking you all, where would you draw the line on genetic testing of embryos? One listener is telling us that she's been working on non-invasive prenatal testing of fetuses during pregnancy. And that we're seeing, as you know, a lot of termination around these diagnoses and screening. And this listener is worried about the impact of all these genetic technologies on the disability community. And this takes it a step back, right? We don't even have to terminate a pregnancy. We can just decide which pregnancy to have. Somebody's asking you, Dr. Hirschlag, are you concerned that if we allow some trait selection, it would create an even more ableist society, a society that is biased against disability and that glorifies able-bodied individuals? And another listening is pushing us further, not just to think about disability and what it means to have a low quality of life, but also to think about what we know from a lot of research, that a high percentage of doctors are biased against disabled people and assume that disabled people have a lower quality of life than they report having themselves. And how that might affect the conversations that we all have and that you as a clinician have with people who consider implanting an affected embryo, not with a disease, but rather with a disability. How do we distinguish genetic disease, serious genetic disease, from disabilities that Nat just inspired us all to see as, you know, the spectrum of human difference that makes life rich and interesting and joyful? So let's dig deeper now into this spectrum between serious genetic disease, what we may agree to call diseases, and the whole spectrum of disabilities that puts us into much more complicated ethical territory. Who wants to jump in on that?
I'd like to. So I want to say one thing first, and by the way, relating to what you said about genes and creativity. So we know that some people who are suspected, famous people, suspected to have had these genes, bad gene, what we call bad genes, were very creative and very important. So Woody Guthrie had Huntington's disease. Paganini is thought to have had a connective tissue disease. Toulouse-Lautrec had a bone disease. So it goes on and on. So there is some connection maybe with people having a disease and then concentrating on being creative and actually going in a different direction because they can't run or because they can't do other things. I want to set the stage, if I can, clear about what we want to do, we in our field, and what we don't think is appropriate as we watch development. And one thing is, we have ethicists here, but let's remember that the science goes fast and doesn't look back to see if the ethicists are catching up. And we're going to witness those things happening, and they're already starting to happen, even to our dismay. So we have to kind of figure out what best advice to give to our patients facing technologies that are happening, that are going to happen. Now, our goal in PGT is to decrease the genetic load of disease. I want to say disease and not disability. Disease I define as a condition that shortens life and a condition that affects quality of life in a very major way. That's my definition. We can go even deeper, but that's where I draw the line. They ask, where do you draw the line? What I want to say, though, is that I'm very proud of all the cases that we have done, each of us individually, and including my partners who are watching it right now, and all the reproductive endocrinologists in the world. We have been able to help individual couples to not to have a baby that doesn't inherit the disease that they carry. However, as far as I know, have not really, in a global kind of way, decreased the genetic load of disease in the world. And the reason for it is because the major killers we have not been able to beat yet. And we're talking about cancer, we're talking about heart disease, we're talking about diabetes, we're talking about morbid obesity. These are all the major killers. And the only way, and there is a big part that genetics plays in it, not only, there is environment. But that's why I'm not against PGTP. This genetics that is a new science, and they're trying to test for multiple genes to try to better predict the health of the baby. And everybody knows who watches it that diabetes is a terrible disease and a and shortens your life and has a lot of impact on life quality and expectancy. And so is a psychiatric disease. You know, what about schizophrenia, etc.? I'm against testing for traits. I think that that's where you draw the line. It's very simple. We're not going to make smarter kids. We're not going to make taller kids. That's just wrong. Now, when I say we're not supporting it, will they succeed in those startups? That we don't know. But I want to say, because they were asking, are we going to create classes? We are. Assume that there'll be a upper echelon that's going to go for the 50,000 or more and going to do that, you know, test the get embryos that are superior in their looks and superior in their mind, and that they're going to succeed. If they do, it's not just this generation, it's not just their kids, it's the kids of their kids. You're going to create a whole family now that is supposedly of a higher IQ and taller because grandpa had money to go to the IVF clinic and get this technology from the startups. It's coming to a theater near you. Beware.
Thank you. I want to address another set of questions from our listeners. And they, Louise, I'm looking at you because of your affiliation and association with the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. So we know that in the US, the chances of these technologies being regulated across the board, the chance is very low. And so that leaves us in a situation where it's either Avner's clinic calling the shots about what they implant and not implant, what they offer or not, or professional societies may create guidelines. They don't have the force to impose them, but they can sort of set the stage for what is standard for clinics nationally. So first of all, do you all think that professional societies are currently starting to address these questions, considering, and this is where it becomes ethically challenging, that the open door and the lack of regulation in a way serves clinics? It allows them autonomy, it allows them to make more money, to offer bigger packages of tests. So there might be a bit of a conflict there between professional societies regulating based on ethical principles and trying to protect patients and make sure patients are informed on one hand, and the interests of the industry on the other. And a more specific question from another listener is about the American Society of Reproductive Medicine's Ethics Committee opinion on transferring embryos, which doesn't really tell clinics what they can and cannot transfer, but rather tells them to inform patients ahead of time about the risks and give them full information. I am quoting the person asking. I'm not actually reading out of the policy. So how can you enlighten us regarding what the guidelines currently say, and what do you think about this built-in conflict between lack of regulation creating more economic opportunities for clinics and companies on all those startups that Avner shared with us on one hand, and the ethical need to protect consumers on the other?
Great question. And you led with that this is permissible in the US, but not in many other countries. So other countries approach this in a very different way. European countries approach it with a lot more regulation and guidance. The ASRM has written that they would exert caution in rolling this out because it is not, there's not enough evidence to say that it's ready for prime time. I'm referring specifically to whole genome prediction models, like to try to avoid diabetes, for example. And the ethics committee I've sat on the ethics committee for ASRM, and ASRM and other professional societies in the United States are supported by dues from physicians. So they are physician guilds, they're physician advocacy organizations. They are not patient advocacy organizations. That is not to say that they don't have the patient's best interest in mind at all, but we have to recognize that they come from the standpoint of being advocates for physicians primarily. So frequently they will not take hard stands, and they have, as you mentioned, absolutely no enforceability. They can't enforce anything. It's all guidelines entirely. Now, the CDC does regulate through SART some aspects of the practice of reproductive medicine. We do have a regulatory arm that we could rely upon if we wanted to. But in our country, since around the 1980s, we've been in a process of, now I'm putting my lawyer hat on, in a process of significant deregulation of advancements in science. Avner's completely correct. Science goes flying forward, especially in this particular space. In other spaces, there are more guardrails, more stops in the process. And I really do think that in this space, we really need to slow it down a bit. And we do have the ability to do so. Will it happen? No, because we're not in the right political environment currently to slow this down. And so then we end up back in this discussion of the enormous pressure on physicians like Avner and patients like Nat, who are faced with an enormous array of unproven options that they get to go over. When you sit down right now with one of paying your $50,000, you just get a probability of an embryo developing a disease. That is not the same as what you were discussing before, Vardit. We were saying, where do you draw the line, and where Avner would draw the line. And I would like to highlight your work in this space, Vardit, where you have tried to define what it would mean to be a serious condition versus not serious condition. Some really, really important papers in that space. So, most other countries allow for screening to select embryos that are not affected by serious conditions. And I think everybody here would agree that's appropriate. Diabetes is a serious condition, but we don't have a single gene that we can point to select for there. So then you end up in probabilities. And in that situation, you're I think, getting into a space that is problematic. So to summarize a little bit what I've heard, at least, there are a lot of options that are ethically available to parents around the world and in the United States specifically as they build their families, especially through IVF. And those are probably very appropriate. And those could include screening for and screening out embryos that are affected by serious disease, with the caveat of these very nuanced discussions that Avner described with families around a variety of different conditions. But when we start getting into whole genome sequencing, we're in a space where we haven't done the work yet, and it needs better control. And unfortunately, we don't have an arm within the United States right now under the current administration that could exert that control.
Thank you. Well, somebody's asking what would be a good political environment to slow down this field, but we're going to table that question. It's too big. And I want to shift gears to two questions that go back to the status of embryos and the more philosophical questions about life. Nat, I see your eyes shining. And the first one is this, and it's for you, Louise. From a liability perspective, is it possible that allowing the transfer of an affected embryo would open the door to legally sustainable challenges of wrongful life? And I'll explain what that is. You had a child with a disability, with a disease, with, let's say, a serious disease, and the child sues the clinic or the parents even for being born based on their pain, suffering, and shorter life. Those lawsuits usually are rejected. In some cases, they have been accepted. I'm sure this is something that keeps Avner's and his colleagues up at night. So as a lawyer, Louise, what do you think about that? And then we'll ask Avner how he deals with that.
Yeah, there is a significant amount of concern from reproductive endocrinologists that I work with around this topic. Judy Dar is probably the person who's written most eloquently at law dean at one of our law schools in the country, and she's an ethicist and just exceptional on this topic. If you want to read more, DAAR. She would tell you that it's very unlikely that any cause of action would ever be successful, although we can't say that it's impossible. The reason being that we tend to believe that existing is better than not existing, and the only remedy under law would have been that you didn't exist. So what are you actually asking for, right? You're saying that it was wrong of you to facilitate my gestation and birth. How in the world could we remedy that under law? We have to have some specific alternative world that existed that we could either return you to, which we can't, or create a monetary amount around. And the only thing is that you would not exist at all. So there's really no way for that to go forward in a court of law as compared to birth injury or something like that, where there's an actual wrong that happens and we compensate patients when that occurs, or an error that actually happens that is truly attributable to an action taken by a reproductive endocrinologist, for example, saying you're screening for a disease and missing it somehow, right? So that might be a cause of action that could happen in the future. But truly saying that, for example, I'm a patient who who am alive, and my parents and their reproductive endocrinologist chose to transfer me as an embryo, knowing that I had a disorder that would impact my life. The only other option would have been that I was discarded, so as an embryo. So there's no real cause of action there under law.
So before going to Avner and asking him again if it keeps him up at night, Louise, you and I in class discuss this with our students every year. And one pushback that we get is, okay, legally you have to compare my existence to the only other alternative I had of not being born at all. But come on, ethically, you should compare my life with the disorder to the life of a similar person without the disorder and compensate me based on that. So don't tire me with the philosophical argument, give me justice.
But that option didn't exist. Like if CRISPR ever comes to be a true option, and you had a single gene disorder and I could have used CRISPR to change it, and I knew that you had the single gene disorder and I transferred the embryo, in that moment, there is an alternative option that existed that I did not pursue for you. But if there is no alternative option, even under ethics or law, in my opinion, I can't give you something that doesn't exist.
Thank you. Avner, your thoughts on this?
Well, I can't compete with Louise's legal sophistication. But one thing that she mentioned, I want to make clear that people understand, those who are watching it and don't know what CRISPR is. There was a slide that Vardit didn't allow me to have, but what is coming? There is November something. So just a few weeks ago in Silicon Valley, a company started out to edit embryos. Now, CRISPR is the technique developed by Doudna and Charpentier. They got Nobel Prize for it in 2020. The only ticket with no males on it. An amazing, amazing discovery, and it's basically a tool to actually cut out a bad embryo. I mean, a bad gene. A bad gene, you know, I'm doing it very schematically, and sometimes you can insert the correct gene, and sometimes you just connect the two ends, and experimentally you can create a normal genetic situation. But doing it in embryos, there's only one guy who did it in China, and they imprisoned him for 3 years. So this is coming your way, and that will present a different issue. Regarding transferring an affected embryo, my approach, 2 things. Number 1 is ethicists insist on saying that the unborn child does not have rights because it doesn't exist. It's a very complicated situation. I do feel that I want the baby that I create to have rights. I do feel that way. I personally will not transfer an affected embryo. And that is according to the guidelines of our society. You were asking, Louise, if we have guidelines. We actually do. And the guidelines say that if the patient wants to transfer an affected embryo, they need to have counseling, very thorough counseling and genetic counseling. And if they choose to do it, it's their right, but it's the doctor's autonomy. They don't have to do the transfer. I can refer to someone else who will agree. And that's what happened to me with the BRCA gene. I was then at Northwell, another place, and you know, it was someone else's patient, but I was the chief, I was in charge, and I did not want to do it. And we had a long conversation, and she had it transferred. And I think she had the baby, and that's a female with a BRCA gene. So it's a complicated thing, but I think that the lawsuit of the baby is not what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is, are we doing the right thing and are we doing enough?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this moral clarity. I'm shifting gears as we're running out of time to address a question that didn't come up at all so far. Believe it or not, there's an angle that we haven't talked about at all. And that is the fact that in order to use this technology, we have to create multiple embryos. And usually most of them will not be implanted. They will stay on ice like Nat's other embryos, or eventually be discarded or donated for research. In some very rare cases, maybe donated to another couple or another person. And we know that there are millions of such embryos around the world that are left over and they are frozen. Clinics struggle often regarding what to do about them. Parents have to pay an annual fee to keep them stored, and if they stop paying and disappear, they're called abandoned embryos. There's a lot of research showing that it's a very heavy, difficult, emotional decision for IVF users what to do with those embryos. So one of our listeners is asking this. Is it ethical? What is the ethical rationalization for producing so many embryos that will never be gestated just to achieve one fully gestated child? It seems that there's very little value placed on the lives of those unused embryos. How can this be ethically supported? I'm acknowledging that this pushes us into the area of personhood and when life begins, which in this country can be a very polarizing and political issue. But because we only have 5 minutes left, I'm throwing all of you this curveball. How do we think collectively about the value of the embryos that we're creating, knowing that not all of them can be gestated? Nat, do you want to say a word about this, considering you actually have them?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have at least 10 embryos on ice that we don't intend to use. We have exceeded the time that our lab will store the embryos, and so we get angry letters from them every month telling us that we need to find a long-term storage solution. And we have explored trying to donate it to a family that wants them because we have received donor gametes and we want to offer donor embryos to a family that needs them. And it is exceptionally difficult to facilitate the transfer to another lab. Um, I, if I won the lottery tomorrow, I would have more children, but it is just not possible for us to have more kids at this point in our life. Our family is complete. We have two children. That's what we intended to have. And now we have these embryos on ice, and it is very difficult. My husband and I have had some very difficult conversations over the past year about what to do with them, because we don't want to simply dispose of them, which means letting them thaw in a sink, and then putting them into bio waste. We don't want to do that. It's very difficult to donate them to research. We have looked into that, and that's very difficult also. The the only thing you can actually I have found with our clinic is that they can practice on them is the only research that they can be used for. So we are just kicking the can down the road right now and continuing to pay what are um, substantial storage costs. I think what will eventually happen is I will get my druthers and I will actually figure out how to transfer them to another organization that they can be donated to another family.
I want to jump in and say that I think when we have a very large patient population, we have to be very sensitive to to the different opinions and the background that people come from. So I represent obviously the liberal approach that, the more embryos, the merrier, and that embryos are not people. Okay, so it's anti-personhood. I don't believe in personhood, but there is Catholic belief in personhood, and I respect my patients who are Catholics. Now, we have patients who have come and asked, don't fertilize all of our eggs. Fertilize only eggs that are meant to go in, which is really what the law in Italy is, by the way. Which has changed a little bit, and it's a little more liberal. It used to be you cannot freeze embryos in Italy, and that's how egg freezing got a big boost with Dr. Porcu in Bologna. But in any case, going back to our situation, I've had patients, you get the eggs. First of all, you try to do not a very aggressive stimulation, so you don't get tons of eggs. And then what you do is, once you get the eggs, you agree with the patients how many of the eggs will be fertilized, and the rest you can freeze as eggs. If you freeze as eggs, they're definitely by NOAA, including the church, not considered people because they have only one set of chromosomes. They're not human yet. And I think that's one good way of going about it.
Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes left, and before asking each one of you to say one idea, one take-home message that you want our listeners to, keep them up all night, and that you want them to talk with their friends about. So I'm giving you some time to prepare that one-liner. I want to explain that the reason I asked Avner not to talk about gene editing is that one of our webinars one of our events in 2023 in April will go deep into this topic of the current attempts to use CRISPR and gene editing on human embryos with the intent of eventually leading to safe reproductive use. And it would be a debate between a leading ethicist and a person leading one of the companies trying to actually do it. It will be an event in New York City. Sign up to our newsletter so that you don't miss it. It will be absolutely fascinating. And that was my plug in order to give you all time. So we're going to go in reverse order. I'm going to start with Louise, go to Avner, and conclude with Nat. One short take-home message.
I think I'll jump off of what Avner was just saying about the pluralistic way in which we each approach our understanding of the value and the intrinsic moral worth of an embryo, a future child, of our process of reproduction, of the choices we can make as prospective parents and parents, and recognizing that there is great value in preserving all of those varied approaches to this, while still finding ways to, as a group of a huge, wide, crazily different and wonderful society, also coming together and thinking about ways in which we can carefully explore these new technologies in a way that is ethical.
Thank you. Avna.
I find that many of the patients that I see, and I'm never the first doctor seeing them. Obviously, they have an internist, and women have gynecologists, etc., have a history of genetic disease in their family and were never tested for a gene relating to that disease. The most prominent one is a history of cancer. I urge the viewers and people who have history of cancer in the family to ask their doctors to do a broad test, not just for a BRCA in breast cancer, but a broad test for cancer gene. Cancer genes are dominant. Your children may have 50% chance of having it. If you do have a gene, come to your fertility clinic. If you're in New York, you come to us, and we will test your embryos for it and help you have a healthier baby. In general, our mission is to give you, with PGD, is to give you genetic options. You're not forced to do anything, but we give you options that technology now allows to have a healthier baby.
Thank you, Avna. Nat, final word.
Final word is have babies, whichever way is possible. Do whatever you can to bring babies into your life. I can hear my son crying in the other room. Don't worry, someone's taking care of him. And it is so hard for me not to just jump up and go care for him right now. We're talking about the continuation of the human race. We're talking about bringing children into the world and ensuring that humanity lives on for another generation. And these technologies offer us a way to do that for people who can't have babies on their own and for everyone else. So I think these technologies have a light side and a dark side, and we have to find the middle path forward through it.
Beautiful. Go take care of your child. We will let our wonderful listeners get back to their families or dinner or dogs. And thank you for being so engaged on the Q&A. You asked wonderful questions. We could not address all of them, but you can email us at the Hastings Center and we will try to get back to you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the wonderful panelists, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Sign up to our newsletter to find out when it is. Thank you. Good night.